Quilters Newsletter TV, the Quilters community, is brought to you by Handy Quilter, designed by a quilter for quilters. Robert Kaufman Fabrics, quality fabrics for quilting. Sulky, express yourself with Sulky and create with confidence. And The Warm Company, inspiring products for creative people.
Today my guest is ZJ Humbach, who is the owner and operator of Dream Stitcher Studio out of Nederland, Colorado. And today ZJ is going to be talking to us about using different threads for your quilting and sort of helping us work through the mysteries of what works and what doesn't work and why. So ZJ, please help us understand some of these things, and we'll start with this two-color block here, which I think can be kind of tricky.
Yes, it can, Julie. As a matter of fact, I'm finding more and more that with today's fabrics, people are having a hard time knowing what threads to use, especially when we're using an all-over design or a pantograph, which, as I like to describe it, is called wallpaper for your quilt, because the design goes from one end of the quilt to the other and covers it seamlessly. One of the most difficult blocks is when there are two contrasting colors and the colors are very strong, such as with this blue and cream, light cream block here. I brought 4 threads today that have potential to work on this quilt, and I want to show you the differences of how each thread can appear. And one thing people need to remember is that what you see on the spool is not always what you're going to see on the quilt. For instance, this thread matches the cream fairly well, and on the spool it actually looks a little bit darker than the cream on the block. My trick that I tell my clients is we take the thread and pull out quite a bit and puddle it on the quilt, and it will give you a very close simulation to how the quilting is going to look on the quilt once it's finished, and it is very, very close. As you notice with this, the cream color tends to disappear in the cream fabric, but then it's very harsh against the dark blue. And so that's what you're going to see when it's quilted, and it's okay, but it's not the most pleasing look that I think we could get. The other option that many people gravitate toward would be the blue, because they want to pick that up. And it does match, and it's a good option until you start puddling it. And you are going to see that dark blue everywhere the white is, and it gives a rather stark look, and with an all-over design it's not necessarily pleasing, and it will bother a lot of people once it's quilted, because that's where your eye is going to go on this quilt, is right to that dark thread.
And so in that sense it would maybe take away from the piecing, because your eye will go right to the dark. Okay.
And it will be a very strong draw for you that way and be distracting.
Okay, so not cream colored and not dark blue.
Right, because either way, it's what's going to be the lesser of two evils. Do you mind the white on the blue or the blue on the white?
Okay.
What I recommend to folks, especially with the red, white, and blue quilt, for a lot of our patriotic quilts that are popular, black and white quilts, and even in the case of this navy blue and cream, is a gray thread. It is not as harsh as a navy. It's certainly not as harsh as a black thread would be. And it tends to give a little softer look, but you have to be careful with what color gray. You need to get into shades. So when I puddle this, it's still a pleasing look, but you see it in the white. But you see how it's a little softer on the blue as opposed to what the cream was? Let's just take a look at that.
It still seems like your eye would go to that and not to all the work that you've done in the piecing and everything.
A lot of it, Julie, is personal preference, because some people truly want the quilting to show. Other people want the piecing to show. So I try and find out from my client, what do you want to show? What is your preference? What's your favorite colors? How's the quilt going to be used? There's a lot of considerations in choosing the right thread. But let me show you one more option.
Which is this little...
Which is the lighter gray.
Okay. I think that would be too light.
You think that would be too light?
Well,
looking at the
initially,
spool?
yeah.
Mhm.
I mean, initially I'd be like, I think it's a little bright.
But let's try it. You will still see it. But when you do, it's going to be sinking into your fabric and into the batting. So the stitches will come down, and it will actually give more texture than thread for the overall look. It disappears into the busy part of the print, so you aren't detracting, and it's very, it's not as noticeable on the dark as what the white was. It's a little more subtle. And so that's my recommendation, is play with the thread, try out the different colors, and remember that it will look quite different on the spool than it does when it's actually on your quilt.
Well, that would have surprised me because that's not the one I would have picked.
And which one would you have picked?
Probably the darker gray, but now that I've seen it, I would probably pick the silver.
You just have to play with it, and that's half the fun. Just like we play and audition fabric, we want to audition our thread.
Right.
Now, another one that I find people have a hard time with are taupes, because they're very subtle, and we want to, my advice to people with a taupe fabric is let the fabric speak. Respect the fabric and bring out its good qualities. So for a taupe, I tend to like a matte finish, which would be a nice cotton thread as opposed to a shiny thread or one with a sheen. And the weight of a thread can make a huge difference.
In taupes or just in general?
In general. The lower the number on the top of your spool or inside of the spool, it will give a weight. Usually it's a 40 weight, 50 weight. Sulkies have 12 weights. The lower the number, the thicker the thread. The higher the number, the thinner or finer the thread.
Okay.
So let's play with this. These are some options that I brought today. And as you can see, they all seem like they would have potential. Again, pens on, that wonderful southern word. It pens on. And I know you've heard that before.
I have, yes.
It pens
That's
on
your
your
word,
preference. Yes, it is.
It is a word.
Depends on where you're from.
It pens, yeah.
All right, so let's try this chocolate to bring out the dark brown. And this is a, whoops, sometimes the threads don't always cooperate. It looks wonderful if you want to camouflage the quilting on the dark brown, but look what happens when we go in that center. It's almost reading black. And if you want the piecing to shine, which this design is coming inward on the block and saying, look at my star, it's going to detract.
Right, and again, you're talking about an all-over pantograph. You're not talking about custom.
If I was doing custom, I would have no trouble if I wanted to use some of that in here on the individual blocks, maybe if I was outline quilting or whatever, and wanted to create texture. But for an all-over pattern, which I would say about 85% of my clients will go with an all-over pattern because it's less expensive. And if the quilt is just going to be used as a utility quilt, as a drag-around quilt, as a quilt for watching TV or a football game with, you don't necessarily need to spend a fortune and pay for a custom quilt. If it's something where the design truly calls for it, or if you want to keep it in the family, that's when you may want to spend your dollars on custom quilting. So if we're going to pay for pantograph or all-over quilting, let's do one where it really enhances the quilt, and now it comes down to your thread. And of course the choice of the pattern design. So I think the dark brown is a little harsh. Let's try, whoops, let's try this lighter thread, which pulls out the nice light color here, and as you can see, it really blends well. But oh my gosh,
once you get into the dark.
Now look at what we have. It's very harsh. I'm not saying it's wrong. If that's the look that a client wants, that would be fine. But people need to be aware that when we get out here, you will see those differences.
Right, and then because of your blocks probably going, you know, coming into each other all around, you're going to have a lot of the dark.
Yes.
As opposed to the light, so.
And it may work fine. If I had more of the quilt, it might give us more of an idea, and also your design will dictate, depending on how busy and how tightly stitched the design is. If it's more wide open, it may not be as much of an issue. Again, it comes back to that personal preference. To me, this would not be my first choice.
Okay, so not the darkest and not this light one.
All right. Now we get into, as I was saying, the shading. This one is kind of in between. It almost takes on a little more of the taupe side.
But it's shiny, or it looks shiny on the
It's a
spool.
little shiny, but it's still kind of in that same category. Looks great in here. It's not quite as bright on your center star piecing. But again, when you come out here, you're seeing the thread a little bit more, but not as harsh. I think that has a little more subtle look with the taupes. And again, I don't want the quilting overpowering the beauty of the taupe.
Right, right. So this would be a possibility.
This could be a very strong player. Let's try a shade darker.
Which would be this way?
This is just, as you can see, a little more toward the brown tone, a little bit warmer, a little bit darker.
And not shiny.
Not shiny, and it's not exactly matching any one block.
one color.
Although when it gets on here, look at how it blends in with those center blocks. It's a little bit darker, so you will see the thread more for texture when you get into the center, which is nice. Again, you're going to see it a little more on those outer blocks.
Right.
It's definitely a contender, but I'm still not happy with how
With
it's
as much as
looking
it
out here.
shows.
This is the problem we're running into with some of these beautiful fabrics we have nowadays. We have depth of color and richness, and sometimes it's very difficult to decide what thread to use. This one is entirely different, as you can see. Let me put these back here. We've stayed to the true brown,
Right.
muddied colors.
I don't think that that one looks like it should go at all.
No, it's kind of a rusty milk chocolatey tone. But let me show you some magic here. Sometimes the thread we least expect is the one that works best. Two things here. This is a much thinner thread. I'll try this one.
Okay, so I can't visually see the difference.
Okay, but you
But
can
I can
feel
feel
it.
the difference,
And
so-
maybe when we put it down here, you can start to see the thickness there.
Oh,
See how
okay.
much thicker that is? All right, so now let's try this one because it will sink further into the thread or into the fabric and into the batting than what the thicker thread will. So you won't see it as much.
So the finer threads are actually going to sink in and give a bit more texture, depending on how
They
it's
will
quilted?
sink in more. Typically, the thicker threads give more texture just because they're more visible. They're a heavier thread.
Okay.
But these will sink in just a touch more. This one adds a little bit of visibility to the quilting, but I don't think it overpowers. You're going to see a little more in here. It picks up the lines in the center pattern, and it also gives a little bit of interest outside, I think, without overpowering the
too
block.
much.
What do you think?
So, I mean, it's nice. It's not what I would have chosen at all. I don't know that it's still my favorite, but to have the options is something that I would have probably just gone with one and not even thought to give any choices. So.
And at this point, I would probably say, let's just keep playing with tone. We're in the right neighborhood.
Right.
Keep playing with tone until you find the one you want. So that is my recommendation for the taupes, is stay nearest the color of the taupe. Now.
So I guess my question would be, when you've got all of these different choices and all these different threads, how do you finally narrow it down? Does it end up just being a customer's decision?
Yes, it is, because it's their quilt, it's their creation. It depends on your long arm quilter. Again, depends on. Every long armer has a different philosophy, and some of them just want to take the quilt and do their own magic on it. Others like to work with the customer. Others want the client to make all the decisions. And then some of us like to collaborate until we reach what we both feel is good. But in my mind, it's always the customer's final choice.
Well, and I think that we have so much going on here that we should really continue this on another day, because there's no sense in rushing, and there's so much more information that we can cover. And so I want to say thank you very much.
Well, thank you, and I'll be delighted to come back.
And I'm happy to be wrong when I'm wrong, which doesn't always happen. So, but please, I have to get you back in here to finish this.
Remember, there's no wrong when it comes to quilting, just different.
Just choices.
Just choices.
All right. Well, thank you very much, ZJ.
Thank you, Julie.
Quilters Newsletter TV, the Quilters Community, is brought to you by Handy Quilter, designed by a quilter for quilters. Robert Kaufman Fabrics, quality fabrics for quilting. Sulky, express yourself with Sulky and create with confidence. And The Warm Company, inspiring products for creative people.